Work on the patient and family support team here at the hospice. Last year, I helped develop and deliver a pilot service delivering counselling to people who are homeless. So today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that, and also the aims of the session are: I'm going to briefly look at why people become homeless, explore the barriers that people face in accessing support, discuss the recent pilot study which offered the bereavement and loss service, think about what needs to be considered when counselling someone who is homeless, and just explore some of the counselling techniques that we used during that pilot study. So why do people become homeless? There are many reasons why people become homeless. They may lose their job, a relationship might break down, they may have mental health problems, drug and alcohol issues, they may be on a really low income, they may be fleeing domestic violence, they may be fleeing abuse. When people leave prison, army or care, they often become homeless. They may not be able to just afford the rent just because of the cost, and benefits delays or problems. The list is extensive and unique to each individual. We can generally place people into two very broad groups of homelessness. So we have something what's called transient homelessness, which is people that become homeless due to either a single or a discrete set of events that lead to them becoming homeless. So these people may sleep rough, they may or may not sleep rough for short periods of time, they may be staying with friends, sofa surfing, but generally move through the homeless system quite quickly. As an example, I worked with somebody who had fled domestic violence. She had a house, she had a job, but had to leave that for her own safety. But she then couldn't afford a place of her own, so ended up in a hostel. There is a saying that is bandied around about any of us are only 2 pay packets away from being homeless. So this is why it can be sometimes known as economic homelessness. The other group of people is chronic homelessness. And this is where people have experienced very long-term or repeated episodes of homelessness. It often includes lengthy periods of rough sleeping. And this type of homelessness is more complicated in terms of it's not just about the housing itself, it's about additional problems that may be there in terms of people have additional issues such as drugs and alcohol, mental health issues. Basically, that makes it harder for people to maintain that stability in their lives. What we're going to look at now is something called compound trauma, and there is a lot of studies around homelessness and the link with compound trauma, which is also sometimes known as complex trauma. This is where people have experienced a sequence of traumatic events over a period of time that they've not been supported to or not been able to recover from. These have often started in childhood and will continue throughout somebody's life. So this is just an example that I kind of made up. So this man, his mum died when he was age 9. Dad couldn't cope with that and started hitting him, lashing out. So the child became a victim of physical and emotional abuse. The child was taken into care at age 13. By age 15, he started to offend and he starts to experiment with drugs. Age 18, he goes into prison, and when he comes out, he's homeless. So he starts to use drugs and offend again. So these are all different traumatic events that this one person may have experienced. Any of us can experience emotional and psychological distress after just one physical life, after one traumatic life event, but many of our clients have had more than one. This often means that people that we're working with have multifactorial needs, so they may have physical, psychological, social needs all at once. So the reason that I've done this diagram with almost like those things stacked on top of each other, because that's what compound is, so things building on top of one another. But I've also demonstrated that way, and I likened it to a stack of pennies, which is sometimes a concept used in psychotherapy in terms of showing how a skewed penny can just cause the pile to skew, and the more skewed pennies they are, the more likely that pile is to collapse. And if we think about a traumatic event is like a skewed penny, the more traumatic events that they have, the greater the impact on their psychological well-being. So when we look back at this person, you look how that kind of those traumas skew in that system for them, and the more likely they are to have difficulties as they grow older. So in terms of, I've linked this a little bit, our service to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if we think about it and linking it to therapy or counselling, really normally counselling is aimed at those top two parts of the pyramid, really, that's self-actualization and esteem. So, in counselling, we'd often be working at relationships, building someone's self-esteem, developing their strengths, and eventually maybe that self-actualization, achieving a person's full potential. But if you look at this theory, the foundations, those bottom parts that we need in order to support the top bits, are quite significant to homeless people, because they often don't have those things at the bottom. They may not have shelter, they may not have regular food, they may not be able to get a decent night's sleep. And even if they are in temporary accommodations such as hostels, they still don't have that stability of their own place and that security of it. And in terms of safety as well, they may not be very safe where they're staying. So how do you work with somebody who has potentially complex trauma, multifactorial needs, when they often don't have those very basic needs being met? So that was something we had to consider. And what we also needed to consider was the barriers that homeless people have generally, but in particular when it comes to accessing a counselling service. So in terms of the barriers that we found people had, with things like having their basic need met, just like we were saying before. So they may have other priorities that day. So when we're talking about attending a counselling assessment or appointment, they may not have shelter for that night. They may need to go and find food for that day. Most people give a planned appointment at a fixed time, and if they don't attend that appointment, that can go against them. They may not be offered future appointments, or if they fail to attend so many, they may drop out of that service. Many homeless people find this quite challenging and often really fail before they've even started. They also may be involved with other services at the same time. So they may be known to drug and alcohol team, the housing office, health services. And coordinating these can be quite a challenge for people. They often double book, and it's difficult for them to prioritise their appointments. And some services can be less flexible in terms of they feel they should be the priority. Another difficulty that homeless people might have is knowing where to access support. So, people don't necessarily have the same access to information that we might have or other people might have. So they do rely on being given that information of what support is out there. Some people may not have access to funds to attend appointments. They might not have enough money for the bus fares. They might not have a mobile phone, or they don't have any credit on the mobile phone to make those appointments. Also a significant amount of low education and literacy within the homeless sector, which does make it harder for people to understand what services are out there and how to get that support that they need. It can also be a barrier because people do have a fear of looking stupid, and that was something I came across quite a lot in the pilot service, really, people being challenged. So, like say if they had dyslexia, they couldn't understand the appointment letters and stuff. So, that kind of education barrier was a big thing. Really about people having multifactorial needs. So they may have mental or physical health problems, which just makes it more challenging. to work with somebody. So, and often services won't support somebody if they have another need as well at the same time. So mental health services will often refuse to work with somebody who has a drug and alcohol issue. And then the drug and alcohol service work with somebody who has a mental health issue. And so it almost becomes that, well, who's going to get the issue sorted out first? They can't sort out the drug and alcohol issue without sorting out the mental health issue, and they can't sort the mental health issue while they're still using drugs. So it can be a big challenge. A lot of homeless people face prejudice in terms of people have their views on why people become homeless and how they live their lives. It leads to people feeling intimidated or judged, and it can lead to services becoming discriminatory, whether that's inadvertently or deliberately. Sometimes people who are homeless, because of things like complex trauma, do have difficulty in regulating their emotions, and this can sometimes lead to them becoming banned from services. You know, if they're going in and they're presenting as quite aggressive, or if they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, services can refuse and will refuse to see them. And just a general thing really about counselling, it can be a difficult service to access because there are not enough counselling services out there, and that's for the general population. And if we think about all these barriers that people who are homeless face, it's going to be even more of a challenge for them. So when we were looking at developing a service, one of the things that we were considering was PI, psychologically informed environments, which is one of the approaches that's quite current with people who are homeless, and providing a space for people that is more linked into their psychological makeup in terms of their thinking, emotions, personalities, their past experience. So it's looking at somebody in their own environment, just thinking about it from their unique perspective. So this is something we wanted to bear in mind when providing services for someone who's homeless. Obviously, we were providing a counselling service, so we had to aim it at people's psychological well-being, and that was the main focus. But we already have counselling services in the hospice, but they weren't relevant or weren't the right service for somebody who's homeless. We knew that we had to adapt that to meet the needs of this unique group of people. So we needed to think about how can we provide this service for this marginalised group of people, and where are we going to do that? So in 2020, we received some funding from the big lottery to set up a counselling service for people who are homeless. It was agreed to set up a pilot service to offer counselling support to people who had experienced bereavement or a significant loss. And that significant loss had to be having a big impact still on their lives. We set up the service in August 2020, and it ran for 8 months in total. And this allowed us to gather information on the level of need and how we could meet the needs of people in the homeless sector. We took a PI approach to the service to ensure we were thinking about it from the perspective of this socially excluded group, and to take into consideration their unique needs rather than fitting it around our traditional counselling service. We knew we had to change that. So what we wanted to do, if we were thinking about the barriers we mentioned before, we wanted to break them down. We wanted to have that psychologically informed approach, and we wanted to bear in mind people's multifactorial needs. So the way we did this was we gave people choice. So this is the choice of where they wanted to meet us and how they wanted to meet us. So I would go into the hostels where people were living. During COVID, some people were relocated to hotels, so we'd go there. We used one of the rooms in one of the hospitals, and we had a couple of agencies that allowed us to go in and use their rooms to see people. So this was really to give them more choice of where they would feel more comfortable, where they'd feel more able to be honest and open up, and also where they were willing to travel to. You know, we recognise that, you know, people may not, like we said before about finances, they may not be able to travel, they may have other priorities. So if we were going to them, it was more likely that they'd be able to attend. In terms of using other people's buildings, it was a bit more restricted than we'd hoped, because due to the pandemic, they weren't allowing as many people through the building. And we also offer people video or telephone counselling as well. So we tried to make it as much of a choice that we could for those individuals. We tried to be flexible. So we did give clients, you know, appointments in advance, but if they cancelled or they rearranged, that was okay, that was fine, there was no penalty to that. Also, if they didn't turn up, we would try and chase that up with them, and we would offer another appointment if that's what they wanted. We had to be accepting of people that they may be using alcohol or drugs, and they needed some level of substances before they came to see us. So some services have a zero tolerance for any drugs or alcohol consumed before a session. Our view was that as long as they weren't heavily under the influence, as long as they could still engage with the sessions, that was okay. So because some people, they just needed just enough to get them to the session, to get them through that session. We wanted to increase the chances of attendance, so by sending reminders, I'd text people to let them know when their appointment was, offer alternatives if needed. And we wanted to make sure that the counselling wasn't conditional, and that's conditional from our point of view, so not saying like, you know, if you don't attend so many appointments, then we're not going to offer you anymore. We didn't want to do that, but also we didn't want the hostels using it as a condition for their staying there. So it has to be a choice that people attended counselling. So the types of loss that we worked with, really, this is just like a pie chart of that. So originally the criteria was around bereavement and loss. Now, obviously, loss can cover many, many different things, and homeless people automatically have experienced a lot of loss, just loss of a stable housing, loss of income, status, relationships, etc. So we had to narrow it down a little bit. So if it wasn't a bereavement, if it was around a significant loss, then it had to be something that was having a major impact on their day-to-day functioning. And actually, so when we look at this diagram, we can see that obviously most had bereavement. It was only 7% that hadn't had any kind of significant bereavement. But what they did, though, that group of people was actually women who had had their children removed from their care. Either they were in the care system, or the partner or parents were looking after the kids. But you can see, like, we also work with people who had recent bereavement, historical bereavement, which was also quite a high number. But there's quite a lot of people as well who'd had significant bereavements over a period of time. So in terms of what else we found, this is just the percentage of people who had additional needs. So really nobody walked through that door with just that bereavement issue. You see 88% of people had mental health problems, 51% had a current substance misuse issue, and 46% had a historical one. It's probably quite expected, really, in terms of homeless sector. It's not unusual for someone to have mental health problems. I mean, most of them would have been anxiety and depression, although some may be some more serious mental health issues. And as you can see, everybody really either had a current or historical substance use issue. I suppose the one that was quite striking to me was the amount of people who had experienced childhood trauma. So that was 62% of the people that I work with. And I think that number should be probably a little bit higher, because I think a lot of the people I work with didn't even recognise that they had had significant adverse childhood experiences. So what we can see from that is that most of the people that we saw did have more complex psychological needs. It wasn't just around a bereavement. So we had to really think about how we were going to approach that. And if we talked, like we did, about the compound trauma before, how difficult that might be for somebody. So what kind of counselling did we do? So my approach to counselling therapy is that I use an integrative approach. What does that actually mean? So it means it's a combined approach to psychotherapy that brings together different elements of different therapies. So it might be like using a little bit of CBT, using a bit of person-centered, using a bit of transactional analysis, using relaxation techniques. It was just really about bringing in different tools for that individual person. Because the integrative school of thought is that there is no single approach that can treat each client in every situation. So we really need to be looking at the person as a whole, thinking about the counselling techniques and tailoring that to their individual needs and their personal circumstances. Integrative approach means looking at the person's personality, but also their affective, their behavioural, cognitive, psychological, physiological systems, also addressing their social and spiritual. So it's like taking a very holistic approach to the person. So looking at how their psychological well-being is affected by everything else around them, within them and around them. And integrative counselling means that the idea that there are many ways in which the human psychology can be explored and understood. No one theory holds all the answers. And sometimes even theories can contradict each other, but that's when it's about finding that individual approach to that person, looking at a unique person, how can we support them in their unique way. So person-centered approach, I'm not a person-centered counsellor, but I do use person-centered theory as a basis to any of the work that I do. And I think it's just because it's a great base of working with somebody. So Carl Rogers developed this in the 1950s about saying that for personality change to occur, then you need these 6 conditions over a period of time. So they are the psychological contact between the counsellor and client. So it's not just about being in a space with somebody, a physical space with somebody, but it's having that emotional, that psychological connection with somebody. That the client is incongruent, which means that they are anxious or vulnerable, and that they're in a position when they are feeling that they want support and help, or they have a situation that they feel they are ready to manage better or want to manage better. The counsellor is congruent, so this means that the counsellor is real and genuine with the client, and this is really essential because it allows that trusting relationship to build with the client. The counsellor's congruence can also help defeat negative attitudes or conditions of worth that the clients may have, and just by being warm and genuine with another person helps that client feel valued. This in turn hopefully will turn into positive self-esteem and trust in the client's own judgment. Fourth condition is that the client receives empathy from the counsellor. So this means empathy means seeing something from the views of the client themselves. So it's not about the counsellor's views on things, it's not about societal views on things, it's about thinking about that client's frame of reference, how they see the world, and trying to empathise and see it through their eyes to try and understand what they may be going through and then how to support them. The counsellor shows unconditional positive regards towards the client, and this means is accepting the client for who they are. It's without judgment, and it allows the client to open up more about their difficulties or fears, without the fear of being judged or criticised. And the last one is that the client perceives the acceptance and unconditional positive regard. So it's not enough for the counsellor to give that empathy, that congruence. The client has to feel it, they have to sense it in order for change to take place. They need to feel that they're not being judged and that they have a connection with the counsellor. So when looking at this, really, the person-centered approach, it's basically about being kind, compassionate, and being human, and using those qualities as a base for that therapy to grow upon and change to take place. Person-centered counselling itself feels like this is enough, that doing these like 6 core conditions is enough for change. That's not my practice, that's not how I practice. As I say, I have an integrative approach, but I do see this as an excellent base, really, to maintain and grow that work with clients. It does serve as a great purpose with people with complex emotional needs, because it allows, above all else, a positive relationship to grow. And without a relationship, you can't do any therapy. And I think even as a therapist, when you get stuck, coming back to that person-centered approach is just a really good thing to come back to. It's a safe place to come back to, and you're creating that safe base for that client. One of the other things that we bore in mind when we were developing the service is something called pre-treatment therapy, which was written about by Levy in 2013. And this basically means doing the groundwork before any kind of deep therapy takes place. So within that, we had to look at the establishment of safety. So we were making sure that people were safe, looking at things like suicide risk. We're creating an emotional connection with somebody, and we're creating that opportunity for further work, which is similar to like developing a trusting relationship. So by using skills such as recognition, empathy, validation, containment, being non-judgmental, being genuine with the person, some basic teaching, maybe on some techniques, support, signposting, etc. They just kind of help kind of develop that initial trusting relationship. Common language construction, which is understanding the person's world by understanding their meaning, the gestures, the words and actions. I suppose it's similar in some ways to empathy, so learning about it from their unique perspective. Facilitate and support change, so helping people develop skills, explore ambivalence, so why people are quite not ready to move, why are they stuck at the moment. We look at reinforcing healthy behaviours, positive reinforcement, and we learn from relapse. So it's not about punishment, about if people can't make the changes, or if they're trying to make a change and then they slip back into old behaviours, it's okay, what can we learn from this? And like motivational interviewing, so, and change models, so like how can we move you along to feel more motivated to make a change? And the last one there is cultural and ecological considerations. So prepare and support the person for successful transition. So help them think about new relationships, ideas, doing things differently, accessing other services and treatments. So really it's just about supporting people along that process. So, as previously noted, many of the people that are in the homeless sector do have additional needs and may have experienced significant trauma. So considering the other things that we've talked about, such as the person-centered approach, the psychologically informed environments, PI, pre-treatment therapy, etc., it was very much an individual approach to each client. There had to be a caution about going in too quickly around that trauma or that deep-rooted psychological issues, because of the transient nature of the group. So, people did drop in and out of services, they did have other priorities. Often they'd leave hostel and then, I couldn't get in touch with them for a period of time. So it had to be cautious. We had to make sure that the priority was maintaining safety. So in terms of the work we did, so the first thing we would do under continuing was to assess the level of need and risk. So it would be for things like checking for suicide risk, self-harm risk. So building a relationship was really imperative, and that would be done by using things like the core conditions, the psychologically informed environment, just to build that trusting relationship with somebody. And for some people, this is all they may have got out of the counselling. They had somebody listen to them. Hopefully they felt understood, and that just for that 50 minutes. And they may not have had many sessions, or even if they had a lot of sessions, this is maybe as far as it went in terms of just that kind of building that trusting relationship. But that in itself can be really, really powerful in feeling heard and feeling understood. There was some level of teaching in terms of, it may be using emotion regulation techniques such as breathing exercises, mindfulness, meditation. Many people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences have not learned how to recognise, understand or manage emotions. And this is really important, that they got that basis before any more deeper psychological issues could be looked at. Again, with some people, this is as far as the counselling went, really, to just teach them some basic skills that they could take forward in their everyday lives. And maybe at some point they could come back to counselling and be able to use that as the basis. Client control, what I mean by that is really allowing the client to choose what those sessions what we discussed in those sessions. So although somebody may have been referred for bereavement and loss, it may be on that week they didn't want to talk about that, or they had another pressing issue that they really wanted to deal with. Say for instance there'd been an argument at the hostel, or there was a risk that they were going to get evicted. That's what they wanted to talk about on that day, and that was okay. So even though the referral was around bereavement, it was a lot more flexible within that. Not to say that sometimes there may be some gentle challenge in trying bringing someone back to that, particularly if they were avoiding something that they said they'd wanted to discuss. But really, it was really, really important for those clients to feel safe and to feel in control. And that's something that people who are homeless often don't feel in other areas of their lives. So strengths, so that's really focusing on the person's strengths, so looking at things, the positive things that they've achieved, looking at things from a different angle rather than thinking about the negative things that are happening to them or have happened, or the negative way they've behaved or something. So it's looking at, right, well, what positives can we draw from things? So giving people praise, asking people to praise themselves and look at their own positives, again, is something that they may struggle with, but by demonstrating that to a client and hoping they can learn to mirror that, that's really can be quite powerful again in itself. So sometimes helping people with behaviour changes to manage difficult situations in their life. So it may be that they don't want to talk about things at a psychological level. Maybe they can't understand why they do certain things, but they can know what they're doing and they want to change it. So it may be just like actually teaching things they could do differently, even though they may not psychologically understand it. They may learn different behaviour techniques. And the last one I've put on there is psychotherapy. So that's really when I'm talking about the deeper psychological work that we may have done. This was limited to just a few clients who were willing or ready to go into more deeper issues. And that might be looking around the rawness of that bereavement, or it might be looking at childhood trauma. But this was only really when it was felt safe to do so, and if I felt that the client was resilient enough to be able to cope with talking about that. Unfortunately, the service itself did come to an end after 8 months, and hopefully it will start up again in the future, but as it stands, we had to end at that point. So a lot of the deeper work didn't take place with some of those clients, but hopefully they came away with something positive that can take forward. As I say, even if that was just a bit of basic psychoeducation, or just like the fact of being heard and being listened. Just coming back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the work that we did. So some of the work, actually, we might have even started somewhere near the bottom, because we're talking about safety. So we, like that kind of crisis intervention. Do we need to look at keeping you safe today? We may have looked done a little bit of the love and belonging, because even just forming that relationship with a client hopefully would give them some feeling of relationship, of some level of like therapeutic connection with somebody, even if that was just for a short period of time. There was some work done around self-esteem in terms of really trying to help people recognise their own positives, their strengths, try and give them techniques that would, like about self-care, self-soothing, that would help them have more respect for themselves and look after themselves a little bit more. Self-actualization is a difficult concept for most of the population, and as I said, even more challenging maybe for people in such a marginalised sector. I think with a couple of clients there was some level of like maybe problem solving and maybe some acceptance and stuff like that. But I'd say a lot of the work really was more around that safety, love and belonging, and some of the self-esteem as well. So those middle three sections. So these are just a couple of examples of the people that I worked with. So Shane was 27. He'd lost 3 friends within the quick succession. He was a successful businessman, and he'd thrown himself into work to cope with the grief rather than deal with it. And he just didn't look after himself physically or emotionally. He couldn't cope with work. He lost his job, and then he lost his home. So when I met him, he'd been in temporary accommodation for over a year, and the day I met him, he was on the verge of eviction from the temporary accommodation because he couldn't pay the minimal rent that he had to pay that day. And he was facing the prospect of rough sleeping. He was suicidal at that point, so it was really about checking in with his safety, getting the GP involved, getting him some food, and just really ensuring that safety on that day. We worked together for over 6 months, and he engaged really well with counselling. He learned new skills to help him manage these overwhelming feelings. He learned to be more compassionate with himself, learned when his body was telling him that he needed to take a step back. He learned to give himself space to problem solve, and he opened up about his grief that had been buried for so long. And by the time we finished the service, he was now more open to the idea of letting people into his life. But he'd also got a job, and he was actually had saved enough money to get his own flat. So that was like a really positive outcome for somebody who was more transient homeless, like we talked about before. Another example was Sarah, who was 50 years old, and she'd become homeless about a year ago after family problems and debt made it hard for her to maintain a tenancy. There'd been a suicide in the hostel that she lived, and that had really triggered some very traumatic memories for her of other bereavements, including her sister's suicide 10 years before. She was very agitated and anxious in the sessions initially. So our work really revolved around techniques to help her calm, to help her regulate. She really, really enjoyed the relaxation, the meditation, the breathing techniques that I taught her, and she would practice them in her own time. We never really did any deep work with Sarah, so it was much more around regulation. And unfortunately, the pilot came to an end, and she would have ideally liked more counselling, but hopefully that's stuff she can take forward, in her own life, but also if she ever decided to return to counselling. And the last example was Peter. He was 53, and he'd been homeless intermittently since he was 16 years old. Some of that he'd been on the streets, other times in hostels, sometimes in relationships, and they'd broken down. So it'd been quite cyclic, really. He'd had problematic drug and alcohol use since the age of 17. He had been clean and sober for 6 years up until July 2020, in which he had a big binge on drugs and alcohol, and he nearly ended his life, and he became homeless again. He was referred to the bereavement service around the death of his partner and child, who had died in the early 1990s, but still causing him massive amounts of pain and anguish. So much of the counselling actually did centre around Peter's significant and persistent childhood trauma, because that had really affected how he dealt with his grief. And so he was one, actually, we did do quite a lot of psychotherapy. Peter had never had counselling before. He was very sceptical about it, but he did engage really well. He was generally mistrusting of others, but over the time we worked together, he did show increasing trust in our relationship. And he really did make significant steps in self-awareness, exploration of change during our time working together. And at the time, again, the service ended, he had moved into his own flat and had plans to start volunteer work, so which again was a really positive outcome for him. So that's the end of today's session, really, and I just wanted to explore really how we provided counselling for people who are homeless and how it can be different to your standard mainstream counselling services. What we aim to do is break down the barriers and make the service flexible, just to meet those unique needs of this marginalised group in society. We just hoped that by being human, being empathic, non-judgmental, we could just create this basic therapeutic, meaningful relationship that those clients could take forward and hopefully make positive changes in their lives, whether that be big changes or small ones. And that's me, and thanks for listening.